Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Lisa with Lisa Capen Quilts, and today we're going to spend about 30 minutes together, and I'm going to walk you step by step on how to assemble all of your blocks for the Happiness is Homemade quilt, the mystery quilt that we've been doing for the last several weeks. So in last week's video, in block 16, you'll find your copy of the quilt layout. Make sure to grab that. We're going to use that in today's video. In the very beginning of today's video, I'm going to show you the backing that I bought for my quilt. I love it. And then we're going to walk step by step, assemble this quilt. I'm going to show you how to cut out your borders. I'm going to show you how to attach your borders. And then guess what? We're done with this quilt top. At the end of today's video, I do have a slideshow from Miss Teresa. I can't wait to show you her progress with her quilt blocks. And then we'll take a look at the batting that I chose for my quilt. We'll go over maybe some possible quilting ideas. I'm really on the fence about that at this point. And then we'll be done assembling this quilt top together. Who's excited? I cannot wait. Grab yourself some coffee. I've got mine. And let's go ahead and get started for this week. So here we are with everything that's going to make up my quilt, except for the batting and the binding fabric, which I have set over to the side. Here's what we're doing today. We're going to assemble this entire quilt top, including the border. So let me show you what I've got. This is going to be my backing fabric, and I have 2.5 yards of 108 fabric. Meaning this fabric is 108 inches wide. If you're going with a fabric that is 43 inches wide, you'll need roughly 6 2/3 of a yard of backing fabric. Mine is one great big huge piece. That eliminates piecing the backing for me on this quilt. So that's fantastic. Plus I think it really goes with my quilt really well. Then I have my border fabric, which I think will frame this entire quilt really well. You'll need 2.5 yards of border fabric. We're going to cut 12 strips that measure 6.5 inches wide, okay? And this is 43-inch fabric, 12 strips, 6.5 inches wide. We'll cut this out together when we get to this part in today's video. And then I have all of my blocks stacked up right here. So I can hardly wait to start assembling this quilt. Let's go ahead and start. Where's my sheet? Here it is. I'm going to walk you through how I would approach how I'm going to assemble my quilt. So the very first thing we're going to do is pull up the pie block and the coffee block. So go ahead and find those two blocks, and we will meet at the sewing machine. To help keep your blocks in place while sewing, you can pin baste your blocks together or glue baste them. Now we're going to move over to the sewing machine. We're going to sew together these first two blocks. I have my machine set up to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We want to try to stay as straight and as accurate as we possibly can right along the raw edge from one side to the other. Sewing these two blocks together. We're going to do this seam in real time. These are the only two blocks that I pin basted. The rest will be glue basted because that's my preferred method. Once you're done, you can go ahead and press your seams. As we've made our blocks, we have pressed our seams towards the sashing. And so you can either press your seams at this point open or continue pressing your seams towards the sashing like you see me doing here. Just going to use a little bit of steam, flatten those seams. And now we're done with our first two blocks. Now that we've pieced together the pie block and the coffee block, this is one continuous unit. We're going to go ahead and grab the gingerbread men block right below it and attach it right in this seam here. Again, you can glue based or pin based or bring it straight to the sewing machine. Let's meet there. I'll bring you along as we add our third block, sewing the seam from one side to the other. And you'll just repeat this process for each one of the additional blocks that you add to your quilt. Remember to stay nice and straight. Now we're going to go press this block. You can see I'm going to set the seam, and then we will open up this block and press our seam towards the sashing. Everything is nice and flat. Sometimes I like to come in from the front side and give it another quick press. And we will continue pressing as we add each additional block. At this point, this is what we look like right here. We have the 3 top blocks sewn together and pressed. And now we can go ahead and add the Happiness is Homemade block. That seam will again be the same exact size as the block right above it, the gingerbread men. So this is what we are taking to the sewing machine, and we will be sewing to the bottom of the gingerbread man the Happiness is Homemade block. I'm going to go do that and press this section, and then this will be one section. We'll meet back, take a look at that, and then we'll be setting this section to the side as we move down here. We are coming right along. We have this first section put together. I'm going to show you that right here. Now, one of the things that I love about this quilt, because when we made our blocks each week, we added the sashing pieces. And so this is coming together so easy because all of the sashing work is already done and we're just piecing together these blocks, right? So what actually happens, and what I love about quilts like this, is that this quilt is actually way easier than it looks, right? We've already done all the hard work adding all these sashing pieces, which really wasn't that hard when we made the blocks, adding the sashing as we go along. So here's this first section. Now we're just going to leave this up on the board. We're going to set that off aside for just a few minutes, and we're going to work on this section here. So this section, we are going to piece the toast block to the utensils block right on top. We're going to sew that right in that seam there. Then once this section is together, we're going to assemble the T block right on the bottom right here. So the order we go in next is toast and utensils. Press that seam, add your T block right at the bottom, press that seam. I'm going to go do that and we'll come right back. Now as we come back, we have this section here all together. I'm going to show it to you right here. And once your seams are pressed, there were 2 seams to join. We're going to leave that off to the side, and we're going to move over to this section here. So in this section, we're going to be piecing together 4 blocks. Let's start with the rolling pin and the A is for apple block. We will piece that seam right here in between those 2. And then once that's done, we can add the cupcake block. So let's go do that. We're going to piece this block and this block together, press that seam, and then to the left, we're going to add the cupcake block. We'll come back with this section right here. At this point, we have these 3 blocks together, the apple, the rolling pin, and the cupcakes. Right here is where we are at. And since these have been joined together, that is now going to give us one continuous seam from this point to this point, which means we can now add our eggs block. So go ahead and add the eggs block right to the bottom of this section here. press that, and we'll come right back. Coming back from adding the eggs block to this section here, and this is where we are. I just have to say, I am so loving this quilt and everything is coming together so perfectly. So now we have 3 sections. We have the section that we just put together. Then we have the section with the toast, utensils, and tea block. And then we have the first section up at the top that we put together here. Before we pull this back off the wall, let's go ahead and join this section to this section with the 3 blocks, and that will be sewn in a seam that goes from right here to right here. So now you can add this section to the left side of this section, and that will give you this great big section here, and we'll do that and come right back. Coming back after joining these 2 sections, this is what we look like. And now what we have is that section and our top section right here. We're ready to piece these 2 pieces. You'll be piecing them right underneath of the Happiness is Homemade block, and right where we have the sashing that goes in between these 2 sections. So right in this seam here, what that's going to do is join this whole section of our quilt together. Easy, right? So let's go ahead and sew this seam right here and come back, and you know what? This is going to be super easy. One right after another. So I'm going to go piece this together. We're going to come back, and then I will start on this section to the right. I'd certainly say that this quilt top is going together pretty quickly. So I just joined this whole section all the way through here. This is what we look like. I'm so excited. So now that we have this whole section done, let's just put that off to the side, and we're ready to assemble the right side of the quilt. You'll notice that all of these blocks are the same width from the left side to the right, so the seams will all be the same. So I'm going to bring you along as I piece together the cookie block and the spoon block. Press those seams, and this is what we look like. Next, we're going to add one of the 2 heart blocks. You'll notice this one is a little bit taller from the top to the bottom. This one's a little bit shorter. We're going to add the taller block right underneath of the spoon block. Press that seam, and this is what we look like. Next, we're going to add the cooking pot right underneath of the heart block, right in this seam. Press that, and this is where we are now. Then we come down to the second heart block, and again, this is the shorter one. We'll add that right in this seam. Press that, and here we are. Our very last block to add in this row is the frying pan. It goes right underneath of the shorter heart block, right in this seam. And here is this long section right here. So guess what? We only have 1 seam to piece in between this larger section and this row that we just sewn together. Here is both of those sections side by side. If you have pieced all of your seams with an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance, you should have the same length from both of the bottom of these pieces right in this seam here all the way to the top. Now I'm going to go ahead and glue baste this section to this section and bring that to the sewing machine, and then press that open. And then we have the main body of our quilt all put together. We'll come back when that is done, and we're ready to start cutting out our borders. I thought I'd bring you along as I sew this long continuous seam joining the 2 pieces, so you can get an idea of what that's going to look like when you go to the sewing machine. I really like to take my time, make sure I'm staying nice and straight, and adjusting the quilt as I go along. You can see I have to reposition the quilt as I advance the quilt through the sewing machine. I like to make sure to keep those little seams in the right direction if I can catch it. And we're not putting any tension on the quilt, just keeping it nice and flat and straight all the way to the bottom. You can see I do a little back stitch at this point at the beginning and end of the seam. Now let's go take a look at the main body of our quilt all assembled on the wall. Don't you just love this? I certainly do. All right, let's go take a look at our border fabric. Wouldn't you know that I filmed this whole section and did not have the camera recording? So what I've done is I've doubled my fabric. So I'm cutting 2 strips at one time. I have the folded edge lined up to the line on my mat. We're going to clean up this raw edge. We're going to measure over 6.5 inches, and I'm cutting 2 strips at a time. Measure over another 6.5 inches, and there is our cuts. Once you have your 9 strips of border fabric, I like to go ahead and clean up the salvage edge on my borders. So I line them back up on my mat in the other direction, making sure to keep everything nice and straight with the lines on your mat. Wouldn't you know, I filmed that whole thing, cutting out every one of my strips, and the camera was not on. So we're just going to cut off the salvage edge off of our borders and make them nice and square and straight. Now we can go to the sewing machine. I'm going to make 1 continuous long strip of border fabric. To do that, I'm going to flip over the very top layer of fabric from my borders, and then I'm going to grab the very next 2 pieces. They should be right sides facing each other. And I usually piece my borders together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And that's just to ensure that if I've left any bits of salvage on the ends, I'm not going to have that show on the pretty side of my borders. Now you can notice here that I am not doing a back stitch at the beginning and the end of each one of my seams. I highly recommend that you do that, and I'll show you why at the end of this video. But as we work through the pile, I'm just grabbing 2 layers of fabric and working all the way down. When you're done, you should have 1 piece of fabric left, just like this. For my borders, I like to press my seams completely open. I'll use a little bit of steam, press that nice and flat. You'll do this for each one of the seams where you've pieced your borders together. Just like you see me doing here. I think pressing your seams open for your border helps keep them a little bit flatter versus pressing to one side. And you'll do this throughout your entire border fabric, all of your seams. And once you're done, you're going to bring all of your border fabric and the body of your quilt over to the sewing machine. Because we've cut our border nice and square to begin with, I'm going to line up the raw edges of my border fabric to the raw edge of my quilt, and I'm going to start sewing. You will see I do a back stitch when I begin this seam, and I've gone back to my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now certainly you could pin your border into place, or you could glue baste your border. I wanted to show that it is possible to forego basting your border fabric to the body of your quilt if you wanted to. It just requires a little bit of patience, and remember not to pull your border fabric tight. Just make sure everything's laying nice and flat as you work from one end to the other. We're going to add our border fabric to the right and the left side of our quilt body first. As we approach the bottom, I want to show you, because we're working with one long continuous strip of border fabric, I'm going to cut off the border fabric but allow plenty of room or extra border so that we can press our border nice and flat open, and then we will square up our border fabric once we've joined the right and the left sides. Don't forget to do your little back stitches right at the edge of your quilt body. And while we're still at the sewing machine, I'm just going to flip the quilt over to the left side and add that border as well, and then bring the whole thing over and press both borders at the same time. Once you're done sewing on the first 2 borders, we're going to move over to the iron. I'm going to set the seams really quickly and then open up this border fabric. The seam will actually be going towards the border, and I'm going to press this nice and flat. We'll press this first seam together, and then you'll repeat the process on the other side of your quilt. And once you have both borders pressed nice and flat, I'm going to show you how you can square up your borders nice and pretty. For this part of the process, I like to use a square ruler, and really any size will work. You're going to match up the sides of your ruler to the sides of your quilt. Make sure everything is nice and straight and lined up. And then you can trim the extra bit of border that we left on and square up your border fabric nice and evenly. I'll show you one more time what that looks like. We'll flip the quilt around and we will square up this side. The very raw edge of my fabric on both sides of the ruler. Make sure it's nice and straight. Hold that ruler right in place and trim off that little extra bit. Now you're going to repeat this process. Add your top and bottom border, and then come back and square up those edges as well. So this is what you'll look like once you've added the top and bottom border. Square that up nice and pretty. And this will give us perfect corners at the edges of our quilt. Now I'm going to show you this little seam on my border, and we're going to talk about how to fix this because I really should have done a back stitch when piecing my borders together. I need to do a straight stitch all the way around. So what I really love about doing video series is that, especially if you are brand new to sewing or you've only made a couple of quilts, you're able to follow along in the process. But if you have questions, you can always stop, rewind, and go back and rewatch. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear from you down in the comment section. I try to be really quick in getting back with you when I can, and I would love to help. So let's go over the border a little bit, because you'll notice that during today's video, I changed the number on how many strips that you should cut, because I cut out 12, like my pattern suggests. However, I think I was a little generous in that number. I had like 2.5 strips left over from my border fabric after attaching my borders. So you will notice that the pattern says to cut 12 strips of border fabric. I really think you could get away with 9, 10 if you wanted to have a little extra just in case, but you'll have some left over. So let's change the border strip requirements from 12 to 9. It's going to be the same number of strips you cut for your binding, which is 9 strips of binding. And you'll still have a little bit left over from that. So yes, let's go ahead and change that on our pattern from 12 to 9 strips. And also, because I was at the sewing machine assembling my borders, I really should have done a back stitch at the beginning and the end, and that would have secured the very edges of my quilt. So I'm going to show you what I did. Coming up right here, you're going to see a photo of what my quilt borders look like at the very edges now. I took my quilt back to the sewing machine and stitched a straight stitch about 3.5 in the stitch length, very close to the edge of my quilt. My binding will actually cover the stitching up, but what that's going to do is to keep the borders where I joined them together. It'll keep those seams from opening up as I maneuver and shift my quilt around. So if you don't want to have to do that like I did, when you're assembling your borders, just do a quick back stitch at the beginning and the ending of each seam when you're joining your pieces together. So let's go over the batting that I chose. This is my batting. It is the Fairfield 80/20. The size of it is 81 by 96, and so this is going to be plenty. I'm going to have some little offcuts to save for smaller projects. And I really like the 80/20. Again, this is from Joann's. It is the Fairfield. I really like the drape of this batting. But yes, that's a personal choice, whichever type of batting that you would like to use. And yes, if you would like to share pictures of your quilt's progress, here's the email. You can send me some photos. We can put it in next week's video. I would love to show those to everyone. Next week, I think we're going to show how I've decided to quilt my quilt. I think there's so many possibilities with this quilt. I do think that this quilt lends possibilities to quilt as you go. Because the blocks are bigger and there isn't a ton of them, there's like 16 blocks, I think you could do this as a quilt as you go quilt. What do you think? If you've ever done one, I'd love to hear from you. I personally have not. But the last quilt before last, the mystery quilt, was called Hope, Dream, and Love. And several of you did that as a quilt as you go. So I'd love to know if you plan on doing a quilt as you go with this quilt. What do you think? So yes, I think I'm going to keep the quilting kind of simple on this quilt. I really want everything just to blend in. I guess I will see after my thread shows up and I can determine, which colors I'm going to use. And then I'll have a better idea of what I'm going to do with the quilting. We'll see. So without further ado, I would love to share Teresa's slideshow, her progress with her blocks. I've enjoyed spending so much time with you today. I can't wait to see you next Friday as we wrap up this mystery quilt. Happiness is homemade. Have a great week. Have fun creating. Bye.